the book. Victoria, before we get into what you're writing about in the book, I just wanted to ask you sort of your reaction to the Derek Chauvin trial, his conviction, and the question that we've posed to our audience as well, that this was justice for George Floyd.
Well, I don't think it was justice for George Floyd. I mean, George Floyd is still dead. His family members cannot never, ever hold his hand, give him a hug, scold him for not doing his dishes, whatever, people do with each other. This is just not something they get to do anymore. Do they feel some sort of closure? Perhaps. I don't want to speak for his loved ones. Does this mean that police will stop killing Black people? No, because as this verdict was being read out, we saw that police in Columbus, Ohio, shot and killed a 15-year-old who had, who needed their help, not their killing. So what we can see is that I agree with what you stated in that tweet earlier from Alex Vital, is that the system sacrificed one person so that it could perpetuate itself. What happened is that Derek Chauvin was found guilty. Some people may breathe a sigh of relief because at least there is some consequence for him as opposed to no consequence, but it doesn't mean that anybody else is going to not. It doesn't mean that police officers are going to stop killing Black people, stop pulling them over for bogus reasons. It doesn't mean that people will not be targeted by the system in all the various ways that the system targets people who are Black, brown, immigrant, low income, or marginalized by any of the identities that are deemed, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls it, surplus or, just not wanted in American society.
Amen. Important insights. In terms of your book, Victoria, why was it so important to tackle these misconceptions, and specifically this sort of grand myth that locking someone up is going to rehabilitate them?
Well, we have a nation of 2.2 million people behind bars, and there is this myth that perpetuates that we need prisons to keep us safer, and that people who go to prison somehow get the rehabilitation they need so that they can be safer to be around, or society is safe from them. And that is not the case. And we see this over and over again. And so it was important for me to write a book that looked at and clearly dispelled popular myths of mass incarceration, because now that we have more attention being paid, particularly in the wake of last summer's defund the police mobilizations and more people understanding that policing in prisons are not the answer, we need people to understand what these myths are, who they serve or who they benefit, and then what the actual realities are of what prison is, who is inside prisons, how people are pushed down pathways to prison, and then looking at solutions to these that don't inadvertently make the prison system larger or stronger, or simply take away the bricks and walls and the gates from here and build a separate facility here and say, well, it's not prison, it's treatment, it is home confinement, it is something else, without tackling the root causes of poverty, racism, white supremacy, economic equality, misogyny, patriarchy that we have at the root of many of these problems that society has built for itself.
Yeah, and Victoria, I think one aspect of mass incarceration that people may not be too aware of is sort of the criminalization of mental illness and how that's fueled mass incarceration. So can you talk about that component and how that sort of undercuts the myth that prisons are the appropriate setting for people suffering from these illnesses?
Yes. So there is this myth of prisons and jails as purveyors of mental health treatment, which they are not. Prisons and jails are places in which people are locked into cells or in overcrowded dormitories. It is loud, it is chaotic. Mental health treatment, if it is provided at all, takes a backseat to security concerns and punishment. So if a mental health provider says, you know, we need to be able to see, you know, Vicky, Chris, John, and, you know, Floyd today for mental health, you know, for their mental health treatment regimen, or we need to see them to be able to assess them, and something else in the prison happens, those poor people do not get seen by mental health treatment staff. Furthermore, in jails and prisons, it is the officers, the correctional officers or the guards, who make the decision as to whether or not to bring somebody to either medical treatment or mental health treatment. So if somebody, say, is acting out when they are in jail or in prison, the guard might say, well, they're just malingering, or they're acting out, or they want attention, or they're just being bad, and respond to them with punishment. And they may not actually see a mental health provider at all. There have been studies that show that at Rikers Island, for instance, New York's large jail complex, which takes up an entire island, when Black people and white people are acting out, white people are more likely to be sent to mental health staff for treatment, and Black people are more likely to be punished by being put in solitary confinement for misbehaving. So we can see how this doesn't act as a mental health resource center. And it also doesn't address people's root causes of why they might have mental health issues. Jails and prisons are not meant to be treatment centers. They're not meant to be hospitals. They're not meant to be clinics. They're meant to be places of punishment. And over time, they also become the catch-all for all of society's failings. Society has, by and large, American cities and jurisdictions have cut away at mental health services and provisions, and at the same time cut away from all of the other social safety nets that we need in society for people to be able to not fall through the cracks and to survive and thrive.
And Victoria, now for the book, you interviewed a hell of a lot of incarcerated people, and I'm wondering what was their first sort of response, or the first couple when you asked them what are some of the biggest myths that you're experiencing?
I think a lot of them, you know, there was a varied number of responses, because I think being in prison, they perhaps had different ideas of what myths were floating around, but they very much would weigh in when I asked them specifically about, say, jails as purveyors of mental health care. And so being, as people who had been cycled through jails and prisons, none of them encountered or believed or thought that jails and prisons were purveyors of mental health care. But when I asked them about this, they said definitely not. And they would expound at great length on what they had either seen or directly experienced. And some of them were, I think, a little astonished about some of these myths. Like if you are inside a jail or a prison, you know that it is not filled with just nonviolent drug offenders. And if you let them all out, we will have solved the problem that is mass incarceration, because they see again and again who they are in prisons with. And they say, actually, that's not true. You know, a lot of us are here for, you know, crimes involving violence. Or actually, that is not true, that it is only Black men who are in prison, because we are all here in a women's prison and we are all not Black men. So again and again, I think that them living through their experiences debunked these myths for them. Some of them were surprised that some of these myths existed, like this idea of, you know, the abuse excuse for many people in men's prisons did not realize that women's experiences of domestic violence would be dismissed as an excuse that they were using to try to justify their criminalized behavior or to avoid accountability for their actions. That was a surprise. And then many of them just, like again and again, would just share their experiences that showed that these myths were not true, and then would elaborate on why and how.
And I was wondering if you could talk about the people who are largely missing from the narrative when we're talking about policing and mass incarceration. And I think I'm mostly referring to women and transgender people who are also disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. Can you talk about sort of the marginalized people who we don't hear enough about?
Yes. So when we think about mass incarceration, and this has changed in recent years largely due to Orange is the New Black being a big Netflix show that makes prisons more approachable to audiences that are not familiar with incarceration or might be scared of prisons and incarceration. But women in prison make up about 10%, more or less, of the U.S. jail and prison population. And so often their needs and their issues are sidelined or ignored or dismissed because they are not the issue that affects all 2.2 million people in prison. The same goes with trans people in prison, and we don't have a sense as to how many trans people are behind bars or what their numbers are, what percentage they make up, because jails and prisons don't track, by and large, how many trans people are in their systems. A law was passed last year in California that mandates that the California prison system now has to ask people if they identify as trans or gender nonconforming, and ask them what kind of prison they feel safest in. It doesn't say, do you feel safe in prison? Because obviously that would be, the answer is no, but what prison they would feel safest to be housed in, and they are supposed to take that into consideration. But that is a new law that passed after I submitted my manuscript, because formerly and currently incarcerated trans women fought for that law. But in every other state, all 49 other states, plus every county that has a jail, they don't have to keep track of whether or not they have trans people or gender nonconforming people in their facilities. And many of them might think that they do not. So while they might say, oh yes, we understand there are trans people in society and in prisons or in jails, many of them will say, no, there are no trans people in our jail, never have been. So they're even less thought about. And when you don't think about some of these populations, then you're not thinking of solutions that actually work to either free them or at least to work for solutions that either free them or make their conditions better without causing a larger an enlargement of their incarceration. So for instance, if you know that there are women in prison, you might start thinking about pregnancy behind bars, and something like 5 to 7% of women enter pregnant each year into jails and prisons. And so if you're not thinking about that, then you might not think about, what does prison medical care look like? What does prenatal care look like? Why do we put giant shackles on women when they go into labor, when they're about to push a baby out? Because we think about prisons as being designed for men, and probably large, quote unquote, scary men at that, not somebody who is 9 months pregnant and about to pop a baby out.
Horrific. Victoria, you mentioned Orange is the New Black.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and Rashad and I have talked about this before in the past, and it's just like incredible how, when you think about it, it's really how much entertainment industry and the media really shape the general public's perception of what it's like to be in a prison, you know, unless you know
Mm-hmm.
someone who's incarcerated. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that influence and why it's so problematic.
I mean, we have been conditioned, you know, since we were small enough to be able, or like large enough to be able to keep our focus on a television screen, that, you know, cops are the good guys, you know, like they always get the bad guys. If they break some rules to do so, it's in society's best interest. Prosecutors always get the guy that did the wrongdoing. Jails and prisons are for people who've done bad things. So, I mean, we see again and again and again this reinforcing of media narrative. And for the most part, many of these shows centered around men, because you can make men be scarier, I suppose, with a few exceptions. I mean, you have the shows that focus on women who have killed someone, and it's a very sensationalistic look and feeds into all of our misogynistic fears of women. But for the most part, what we see is the media again and again reinforces these narratives that people who end up in jails and prisons are scary people who deserve to be there, who deserve to be locked away, whom we should want to be locked away. And we should not be thinking about what kinds of conditions they might be in, or how we as a society have these conditions that force some people into criminalized activity, that force some people into violent, chaotic situations, and push